Good morning, and welcome to Issues That Matter. I am your host, Robert Piccone, and I very much look forward to doing the show today. And I am honored to have a guest today that will be talking about things that might not be known by a lot of people. Douglas VOLK, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Now, Doug is a former CEO of VOLK Packaging.
That's correct.
In Biddeford.
Last year.
Which is a well-known, very successful packaging organization, packaging company. And Doug has ventured into an area I would say is probably beyond my ability to even comprehend. But Doug he's an author of a book, now 2 books, and a 3rd book in the works. And Doug, tell us about those books.
Well, that's a long story.
We have time.
We have time. It's a 37-year journey. I started working on these books back in 1982, and just finished them just recently. So it's been 37 years with some stops and starts along the way. And it was just a lot of work trying to raise a family, trying to work full time and commit to the job and to the community and find time to write. It was really challenging, and it took a long time for me to do that. In addition, we didn't have the computers back then. We didn't have the internet, so everything was longhand, and it was much more difficult to find out and research topics.
Now, from some of the reading that I've done, one of your interests, strong interests, has to do with Vietnam vets.
That's correct.
Talk about that.
Well, I was in college in the 1960s. The Vietnam War was going on, and it was really troubling to especially to the college students. The college campuses were protesting all the time. There were terrible things that happened on campus. The students were just totally against the war, and it was just, I was right in the middle of it. 1968 was a terrible year. Personally, for me, a terrible year. It was the year that Robert Kennedy was assassinated and Martin Luther King was assassinated. The My Lai massacre was revealed to the public, and we were watching the evening news, seeing what's happening with Walter Cronkite, and all of a sudden I find out in 1969 that I have a low lottery number. I'm going to be drafted. I faced a very difficult decision. I would have accepted my diploma in June and already have been drafted into the Army. And everyone who was drafted was going to Vietnam, just about. So here I am watching all this stuff that's happening on the college campuses. My girlfriend at the time was very anti-war, and I was with her a lot to participate in a lot of these rallies. In 1969, the Kent State shootings happened, and that was one of the worst things that I can remember. It was just really sad. It was troubling. These kids were killed at Kent State by our own National Guard people. And they were protesting the fact that the war was being expanding into Cambodia. We had been bombing in Cambodia for over a year, and it kept it secret. When Richard Nixon was re-elected president in 1968, I was at his inauguration. And he made a promise and a pledge to bring an honorable end to the Vietnam War. That's what he campaigned on, and that was his promise that he made. And in 1969, we found out that we'd been bombing in Cambodia, not bringing an honorable end to the war, but expanding the war. And kids were being killed, kids were being terribly injured physically and psychologically. And I was going to be heading over there in 6 months or a year. I could be over in Vietnam myself. And it was very troubling. I didn't know what to do, to be honest with you. I had a terrific job lined up after college with a company called Arthur Anderson, one of the big 8 accounting firms. My career path was going to be accounting. I'm a CPA. I wanted to pursue that field. Everything that I worked on was to get out of the workforce, pass my exams, and start my career and start a family. And spending 2 years in the Army at that time would have derailed those ambitions. I could have enlisted for 3 years, but it would have taken me away from this career path that I had. The job was a wonderful job, tremendous company. They were going to be training me. They were going to be allowing me time to study for the exams I had to take all summer, which is the quiet time of the year. And I was going to be able to have tutors. Everything was lined up just beautifully for me. It was just a wonderful opportunity, and that was all going to change if I didn't figure out what to do. I had choices to make, and a lot of the kids that were with us, my friends and people that I knew, were facing the same problem I was. But there was also another set of a whole bunch of people that had high lottery numbers that knew that they were free and they would not be drafted. Unfortunately, I was in the first group. And what was I going to do? What were my options? Again, I could have been drafted, just let myself be drafted. I could have enlisted. The kids left the country. They went to Canada. I can't imagine how you can walk away from your country and leave your family and your life behind, knowing you can never come back into the United States at the time. I couldn't do that. That was way too powerful for me to even contemplate. Just as an aside, I think when Jimmy Carter was elected president, the first thing he did was he pardoned all the kids, students that had left the country to go to Canada during the Vietnam War. He pardoned them. They were able to come home, which was really wonderful. A lot of kids were looking for doctors to create medical illnesses that would get them a deferment. There were quite a few doctors that were sympathetic and anti-war, and were very willing to create medical conditions that would earn you a deferment, or there were doctors you could pay to write. And there were a lot of people that were doing that, and I couldn't do that. I'm not saying that I'm how to say it, but it was the wrong thing to do, and I didn't want to have to live with that decision the rest of my life. Fortunately, I was aware at the time that was the wrong decision to do, and the last resort was to join the reserves. So I joined the U.S. Army Reserve Unit. It was very difficult to get into a reserve unit. I was very fortunate because there were so many kids that wanted to get into the reserves to avoid going drafted.
What prompted you to tackle the subject matter that you've tackled? And one of the things that struck me when I first spoke to Derek, when I called him to see if there was something he would like to have on the show, and he suggested that I contact you. And while you weren't exactly that easy to contact initially,
well, I'm retired.
But I eventually tracked you down.
You did.
But what struck me when Darryl spoke to me was he mentioned Morpheus. Now, for those of you who are sci-fi fans or fanatics, depending on how you wanted to define it, Morpheus was a monster in a movie called The Forbidden Planet, which starred Leslie Nielsen in one of his pre-comedic role days. And that was done back in the 1960s. And to this day, it is probably one of my favorite sci-fi movies that I've watched, and I've seen a lot of them. And when he said Morpheus, the book Morpheus, as in the title, I said, "What's this? Morpheus? That's fantasy." Well, it is, but it isn't.
Well, Morpheus is the Greek god of dreams. I was always interested in dreams. I kept a dream diary at one point, trying to figure out and interpret the dreams. What do they mean? It was a question that would never, ever be answered because we'll never, ever know the answer to that question. And I found that intriguing. And Morpheus as being the Greek god of dreams, I also became interested in the study of sleep. Sleep science was basically a new field back then. This is back in the early 80s. There were very few sleep laboratories for people to sleep in and have their sleep analyzed. Today there are quite a few. Mostly you find them in a lot of places, but back then there were very few. And it was something that interested me. When I learned a little more about post-traumatic stress, when I studied post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the recurring symptoms that the Vietnam vets had were recurring nightmares.
One of the occurrences that struck me when I was doing some reading about your background was you were on a car ride or you're traveling in New Hampshire one night and something struck you and it caused you to react. What did you do?
Yeah, I'm glad to tell you that story. It was 1982. I don't know exactly when in 1982, and it was a beautiful day. I remember there being a very beautiful day. I was driving through rural New Hampshire. I was traveling, selling packaging to all companies throughout New England. I was on the road traveling quite often. So I found myself on a rural road somewhere in New Hampshire, and I had, since 1974 to 1982, this story was coming to me. And I have a habit of talking to myself a lot, and I was in the car an awful lot, so I talked the story out to myself, recorded it on a little dictaphone unit that I had.
If I can interrupt you for 1 second, during this time frame, were you involved with VOLK packaging?
Yes, I was with VOLK Packaging. I've been since 1974. I was on the road for VOLK Packaging, selling packaging.
Okay, all right.
Servicing our customers.
So that was before your days as CEO.
Yes. I worked my way up to CEO. But back then I was just still learning the business, learning all elements of the business. Again, my background was accounting. I've always been interested in having everything line up and balance. It's very left brain activity. I didn't see myself as a creative person at that time. I'm not music. I don't have music and art in my genes, and I never really thought about it, to be honest with you. I was just focused on just establishing a reputation and starting a career.
Well, something in your subject matter really grabbed you, because I cannot imagine a person who does not have a background in writing, who does not have a background in science, grabbing onto a subject matter such as what you've grabbed onto without having hidden somewhere inside your head a plethora of information that you wanted, that you ached to get out.
It basically, I would say that it just had to come out. I really feel like I could not do this. If I didn't do this, I would have been regretful probably for the rest of my life. I just felt that it was something that I really had to do. The question is why. After my college, when I joined the reserves, I went on active duty for 4 months. And that was an experience, something that I've never ever experienced before, obviously. And it was very, very difficult, very challenging. What made it especially difficult was the fact that all the kids that I was training with, most of them were all heading over to Vietnam. They were all drafted or enlisted, but they were heading over to Vietnam. So I trained alongside those people, and the training was very, very difficult, very mean. We were being trained to kill people or not be killed ourselves, and horror stories of things that happened, kids trying to commit suicide that I was with. There was suicide watches constantly because these kids knew that what was happening, and they saw how many kids were being killed over there, and it was frightening to them. It was just mean. I found the whole thing very, very mean. We were dehumanizing people so that we could kill them, and it was just struck me. Being Jewish in the Holocaust, the Nazis refer to the Jews as vermin. In Rwanda, one of the tribes refer to the others as cockroaches. And when you dehumanize a population like that, you don't have any feeling of guilt, I guess, when you kill them. And that's what I was witnessing during that time, and it was horrible. I was there almost as an observer. I was physically participating, but at the same time I was just watching. And I think I have a very good photographic memory. I remember an awful lot of things about what happened. How they took me once and they used me to demonstrate with. They were going to show me how to come up from behind and snap my neck. And I was the subject that they were going to do that to. And they didn't kill me, but it was very unpleasant. And a lot of experiences like that. It was just terrible for me. And when I got out, I resumed my life, went back to my life. We started my job again. And had a nice career for 5 years with that firm. But all that during that time, I was learning more and more about what was happening to the Vietnam vets. It was just, the recurring nightmares was what hooked me initially.
Now, time frame that you're speaking of now?
This would be in 1970. I graduated college in 1970. I was on active duty in 1970 and lived in Boston until 1974.
So you and I are probably in pretty much the same time frames. And I was also in the draft, not the draft, the lottery.
Okay.
My number came up very late, so I was never called.
I wouldn't have been happy with you.
What was that?
There was a little friction between the high numbers and the low number groups.
Yeah, I can understand
There was
why.
celebration and there was crying.
You hate to think that a person's whole fate in life
Oh my gosh.
is dependent upon picking a number.
Or watching a television. There's an interesting story about the draft lottery. I don't know how many people are actually aware of it, but when they they came up with the concept of the draft lottery, they were going to, almost like when they have a bingo, and they put all the numbers in, they twirl them around. Well, they had that set up, and they put January, February, March, all the way up through the end of the year. They put them one at a time, 1 month at a time. And they didn't shake it enough. And because statistically, they found out that maybe like 40% of the first 100 numbers were late in the year, October, November, and December. 40%. Statistically, they said it was impossible that would be that many unless they didn't shake this thing enough so that the numbers that were on the top stayed on the top. And they were actually considered a second lottery, but they didn't do that.
I think back to the year that my number.
What number were you?
I don't remember. I don't remember. But my number came up late, and it was never called. But what I do remember rather vividly is I was on the road. I was working, summer job, and I was on the road on the Long Island Expressway, and they pulled my date. And just as they pulled the date, my car went under an overpass, blocked out the signal, so I lost all sound. And by the time I got through the overpass, they were on to the next number. So I did not know what my number was until I got home that night.
I did mention, you asked about the ride through New Hampshire and what happened that made this sort of humorous. And I was driving along, and I made the commitment to myself that I would write this book. At that moment, I said, I'm going to do this. And I don't know why, but I just had to do it. And I got very excited. I said, this is going to be really a lot of fun to do this. And I started honking my horn. I just started honking my horn. And what was funny about it was that when I honked my horn, I startled a whole bunch of cows. They were on the side of the road.
Holsteins.
And they were black and white cows. I know they're Holsteins. So they were on the side of the road, and they were fenced in, but they were over there. And I almost can remember when I was honking the horn that they all looked up at me. Because they heard this noise, and they probably wanted to know where this noise coming from. And they kind of all looked up at me. And it was just a split second, but it stuck with me. And it was something I probably won't forget. But so that's how when I made that commitment. That was back in 1982.
Now, how did you garner the knowledge necessary to do what you did in writing these books?
Okay. I was coming from square one, or square zero. I had no writing experience at all. Again, I was an accounting major. In college for a while I was pre-med, so I took all my science courses, which then became my electives. So I didn't take any writing, literature. I wasn't a big reader at the time. And I'd never written anything before. So when I decided I was going to write a novel, I didn't know how to do it. I had no idea at all. And when that realization hit me that I didn't know how to do this, and I had no skills to do this, and I'd never be able to do it, I kind of got into the doldrums a little. Because I had set a goal for myself that was unrealistic. And I was disappointed. But fortunately, I got through it, and I had a friend of mine who was a professor at the University of Southern Maine, an English professor. He was in our running group. And so I went to see him, and I told him what I was going to try to do. And he gave me a wonderful suggestion, and a very simple suggestion, and people probably do it without even thinking about it. But he told me that, I told him that I had the story pretty much developed in my head. And he says, just sit down and write the story from beginning to end. Just write it. Don't stop. If you get stuck, work through it. Just write the story from beginning to end. If you don't know the ending, stop. But have the whole story. That would form your first draft of your book. And then you could take that and you could start dividing it up.
But what's the story? Write the story from beginning to end.
Right.
What's the story?
Story. Okay. Well, I'll go back a little, because after college, and I was living in Boston, and I was learning more and more what was happening to the Vietnam vets, and they were experiencing some very unusual, there were unusual things happening to them in terms of psychological things happening to them. And at the time, originally they called it Vietnam War syndrome, I believe. It had not been classified as a disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, as it is now, and people didn't understand it. It was very different than what the veterans from other wars had experienced. Post-traumatic stress has been around forever, but it's just never been classified and identified. And these kids would come home and they were being treated they were awful. I mean, they were being spit on and sworn at and called names and baby killers and you lost the war for us. And I mean, terrible things were happening to these kids. So they just tucked it all down, almost like a jack in the box. They just tucked everything that they had witnessed and everything they had experienced, they just tucked it down until they couldn't hold it down anymore and it explodes. And that's post-traumatic stress. It takes a while for it to develop.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, when you dial back to WW2 or the Korean conflict, there was something called shell shock.
Shell shock, yeah, shell shock. They called it a few other names for it, but it was immediate. It was immediate. When shell shock was something that happened to a soldier immediately, for fear or for whatever reasons. There's a huge difference in the way the soldiers were treated in these wars. In World War I, World War II, they were wars that the whole country was behind and supported. The soldiers went over to fight, and they were there for the duration of the war. And they were with their units, and they stayed together, and they came home together. There was some camaraderie amongst them. Vietnam, it was one at a time. 12 months for Army, 13 months for Marine. You go over, you come back, they place you there, they place you there. There was soldiers were only concerned about staying alive.
Back some time ago, probably a few years now, maybe even longer. We did a show that had both a Vietnam vet and a Korean conflict vet on the show to contrast what the experiences were. It was very interesting.
Well, the Korean and all the soldiers had suffered from post-traumatic stress as well. I mean, it's just any trauma. I mean, these kids that I went through the Army with were all 18-year-old kids, mostly I was in Kentucky. They were all from that area of the country, 18 years old. And how can you take an 18-year-old kid and you can put him in that environment and have them kill people? I mean, you're never the same after you kill someone. Now, I see your buddies and your children die in front of you. You can never be the same, ever. So, but they weren't able to express themselves, and they just kept it down. And I became very interested in it. I started reading all about it. There was information out there available, but there was no internet again. So it was hard, and I was angry. I mean, so it was a 6-year period of time when at the end of 6 years in 1974, that I was just angry about this whole thing. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was able to see what was going on from 3 very different perspectives. And that's basically what sparked the story. So from 1974 to 1982, I just sort of developed it in my head.
And what prompted you to expand your trip, you might say, to the next 2 books?
Okay, well, again, back when I started writing, there were no computers. There was no internet. I remember when I got my first word processor. It was like the greatest thing that I've ever experienced in my whole life. Everything I had to write was longhand. Fortunately, I had a woman that worked with me over the years who could read my handwriting from working with me. It wasn't easy because when you're writing,
I can relate to that.
Sit down, you're writing as fast as you can because you're just kind of going and you're not worried about how it looks. So she could read it and she would type it for me. So that was today. I probably wouldn't be able to have her do that because of other, requirements in the workplace. Which some of the material that I wrote early on in these drafts was probably a little over the top. So
now, in the reading that I've done, your family played a big part in your effort. And the part that struck me was the role that your son and daughter played. Talk about that for a little bit.
Well, I started writing in 1982, and I worked on the novel for 6 years. The original title was different than this Morpheus Conspiracy at the time, but in 1988, I worked on this book for 6 years, and I had a mess, basically. I had a book, but it was really a mess, and it wasn't going anywhere. And I basically said, I can't do this anymore. And I just can't do it. It was too much. I mean, 6 years, countless, probably thousands of hours if I added them all up over the time. It's couldn't do anymore, so I gave up. I just said it's enough, okay? And I made some boxes, because that's my business, and they fit very nicely, snug, and I put the manuscript in these boxes, and I tucked them under my bed. I don't know why, that's the way I just put them under my bed. And my kids were funny because they got angry at me. They were angry at me, because they knew what I was doing, what I was trying to do, and then I had quit. I had given up. And they were kind of giving me the needle, but they saw that I was trying to teach them as a parent not to give up, not to quit, and give it your best effort and do the best you can. And if you've done that, you hold your head high.
So your concept of quitting and winning very much played very much a big part in your process of development, because and I go back to my selling days and my sales management days in my career. I remember the phrase, winners never quit and quitters never win.
There's another expression too. It says writers never finish, they just give up. What happened that was funny about that was the boxes were under my bed, and my kids would sneak into my bedroom at night, and they'd pull the boxes out from under the bed. And they were white. So you couldn't see them that easily. And I can remember times walking into bed and tripping over them and laughing after if I didn't hurt myself, and then I'd tuck them back under the bed again. And they did that quite a few times over a period of time, until I finally decided, maybe I shouldn't give up on this. I should pick up this project and at least take it to a point where I'm happy with it and I've accomplished my goal. So I started working on it again in 1992. I found a new editor to work with, a professional writing coach. That was the advice I got, was to get someone to help me get a coach. His name is Tom Nugent, and he's been unbelievable for me. He's a coach. And
my thinking is that what you encountered was, I would venture to say, is commonly referred to as writer's block, and you busted through the wall.
Maybe, not quite, because I wasn't sitting down trying to write. I wasn't doing any writing at all. Enough, move on. I mean, I had 2 kids at home. They were young teens.
But your kids lit your fire again.
They convinced me. They did. They reminded me of a children's story that has been our family's favorite, and that's The Little Engine That Could. I think I can, and that's been kind of my favorite children's book of all time. So much so that my wife had a lapel pin of a choo-choo train made for me that I wear on my lapel, and the train is heading up, and I wear it when I wear a sport jacket now. I put it on my lapel. They just didn't want me to quit. I don't think they knew what I was doing, but they just knew that I was discouraged. I think I got pretty discouraged.
Talk a little bit about your second book.
Well, I was very fortunate. The first book was published. The first version of the first book was published in 1998, and that was again before the internet, before digital printing and digital publishing, and the Kindles and downloading. That wasn't there. I was never really happy with the ending of the first book. I didn't think that I didn't like the ending. But the book was done, and it was finished. It was printed. There's nothing I could do about that. Until the Amazon came up with a Kindle and being able to go online, put your book online. And when I put the book online, I was able to rewrite the book. So I rewrote it. I think I made it better. I'd learned a lot since the original book.
How long did the rewrite take?
1992 to 1998, it's another 6 years. 6 years. So they're down from 82 to 98.
It's a monstrous time commitment.
Yeah, I didn't think of it at the time. I think if I did, I probably wouldn't have been able to do it. I never kept track of that until now. Now I look back at it, but I didn't keep track of it. But 1998, the first book came out, was published. And then I'm not sure the exact year, but when Amazon and online was available, I put the book online again, and I rewrote the ending. And I rewrote the ending so that the book didn't end. The book would lead into a second story. Because I had an idea, I'd like to write another story and another book. But if I ended this book, I couldn't really I couldn't pick it up. So by rewriting the ending,
With both. Both of them. I'm gonna. Let the viewers see them.
So when I started to rewrite the ending, and that gave me some ideas for the second book, and I was enjoying the process, and I really loved it. I mean, it had its highs and lows, as you'd expect. And I think that I realized that I didn't know. There's a lot I needed to learn, and I wasn't bashful about admitting that. I really had, I was coming from square one. So when I first started to write, the English professor invited me to take his fiction writing class at the University of Southern Maine. I took that class, and I tell my wife would ask me before I went to class whether I had my Pampers on in front of the class. I was so scared about having to stand up in front and read to all these people who are writers and what I've written. It was very frightening to me. I survived that. I think I did okay. And Ken Rosen was very supportive of me. He invited me to attend the Stone Coast Writers Conference at the Goring campus of the University of Southern Maine, a week-long writers conference. They had authors and publishers and all kinds of aspiring writers there for workshops and seminars and social get-togethers. So I immersed myself in that world for a week. I met a lot of people, got a lot of ideas. I became close friends with Carolyn Shute, whose novel at the time, The Beans of Egypt, Maine, came out, and Ken was instrumental in helping her get that book published, and she became a very successful writer. It was a whole new experience for me. It was just another world. I had no idea about what happens in this world. One of the benefits was that the professors, the invited guests that were lecturing the writers, offered to read your work, at least a section of it, and comment on it, and give you some constructive criticism on your writing style. So I did that, and the woman who read my story, one of her critical comments was that there was too much gratuitous sex and violence. Those were her comments. Too much gratuitous sex and violence. So I took that to heart, and I started working on the rewrite, and when I finished a good portion of the rewrite, I sent it back to her to read. She said, when you're ready, send it back to me, I'll read it again. So I sent it back to her again, and she sent me back a note. She says, I remember more sex and violence. I said, you told me that there was too much, and now you tell me there's not enough.
Run that scenario back.
Her first comments in the first volume was that there was too much gratuitous sex and violence.
Okay.
It doesn't serve the story. It doesn't serve the story, and it's not there for a reason.
Okay, there's too much sex and violence.
Shouldn't be there. So,
and my thinking is that it was probably there was too much sex.
It was the books.
You talk about a war. You talk about a book about a war. Of course, there's going to be violence.
The books were risque. I didn't want to write an X-rated novel, so that wasn't my goal. So I
kind of thought that.
Yeah. So there's a line. You can go up to a line, but you can't cross it.
It does jump out at you.
It does, but I wanted that. But I just didn't want to cross that line. And but when I cleaned it up, she came back to me and she said she remembered that there was more sex and violence in the story. So I put it back in, at least some of it. But so I learned a lot.
So she ended up doing a reversal.
Yeah.
Initially, there was too much sex and violence, and then when you did the rewrite,
it wasn't enough.
There's no sex and violence.
Yeah. I remember sex and violence, she said. Those were her words. I still have her letter. So I remember more sex and violence. I said, well, you told me to take it out.
The first book, Morpheus Conspiracy, talks about, I have not read the book, I just haven't had time. But what I have read, I've enjoyed. But the book is about a Vietnam vet who experiences horrific things in the war, in the conflict, and he comes back and he discovers some things about himself that he never even thought about.
Well, he didn't know. Just to back up a little on that, the main character in the first story, I'd say it's not autobiographical, but it could have been.
David Collier?
David Collier, and he's a college student like I was. He's got a low lottery number like I did. He had all these protests that were going on while he was in college, and he had decisions to make. And he made the right decision. For him, he said, I'll be drafted. I'll go with the draft. I'll serve my 2 years, and I'll serve my country, and I'll be fine. Unfortunately for him, he was over Vietnam, and he'd been trained, to survive, and he was with a buddy of his who unfortunately was on drugs, and it was an attempted rape of a Mama San's granddaughter, and he just couldn't watch something like that. He just couldn't deal with it. And when his buddy was almost killed, Mama San was going to take a knife to his back, he shot the Mama San, killed her, basically to save his buddy. He'd been trained, to work on instinct. He saw a knife about to be plunged into his buddy's back, and he shot her and killed her. I don't want to spoil the story too much, but when she dies, she passes on a curse to him. Through her eyes, their eyes connect, and she transfers this ancient evil curse into his brain. And he feels something. He feels it.
He comes back from the war, and he meets a psychiatrist.
Well, he's back home, and it's 4 years later, 1974, and he wants help. He's in trouble. He's recognized that he's in a lot of trouble, because of what happened and the development of post-traumatic stress. And the VA was offering help. They were running pilot programs to treat these kids and figure out what the heck was going on and identify post-traumatic stress disorder, identify it. And he became a subject of a psychiatrist who deceives him and uses him and just terribly disappoints him for his personal gain. And without spoiling the story, but the psychiatrist realizes that David, the Vietnam vet, has the power to invade and enter other people's dreams and nightmares. I call it somnambulistic telepathy, telepathy through dream sleepwalking. And that whole idea came to me, and again, I studied the post-traumatic stress and realized that the recurring nightmares were a theme, and unfortunately, of what was happening to the Vietnam vets. And the story just developed from there, just went on from there. It's a story of betrayal. When I was writing the first book and I was trying to make a statement, I guess, I don't think I realized it at the time, but to explain what happened to me and what I was witnessing, and it was a betrayal. It was a terrible betrayal, and as a result of it, there were thousands and thousands of kids and civilians and men, women, children that suffered because of this, and it was unnecessary, and it was a corrupt government that was just keeping
now
it.
Let's dial back again, and let's talk about the Morpheus connection. Now, in the movie, Morpheus was a monster created by the residents of this planet, and it was created via their dreams, and those dreams ended up annihilating the entire population.
Well, that's could be called very similar to the curse. I mean, he realized that his dreams were real to him. He was actually living in a dream world, a paranormal world. He was not there. He was up here, and anything he was doing and anything that was happening up here.
He was living the dream.
Living the dream. He was living the dream. But Morpheus, Regard of Dreams, is hijacked and becomes evil and creates this power of somnambulistic telepathy, which I call ST to make it easier to say. And that was a phenomenon that had never ever been documented before, never discovered. Ability for people to travel in and out of other people's dreams. And a sleep scientist who uncovered this new phenomenon, she worked on it. She tried to develop it. She tried to work with her patients, her sleep subjects, to see if this was actually happening or not. So it was just an evil version of Morpheus, I guess. That's what it is.
And now the follow-up book, Surgeon's Curse, where does that take us?
The first book takes place in 1974. You go ahead 12 years to 1986. And the first book, 74, was chosen because that was really the onset of post-traumatic stress being recognized. In 1986, DNA had just arrived on the scene. It hadn't quite arrived. It was almost on the scene in 1986. And the science of DNA hadn't existed, hadn't been developed until 1986, when there was a murder case in London or in England. It was solved using DNA. And that was the first time that it happened, and then obviously it's a science that's been developed. So I chose 1986 because I was very fortunate. I have a niece who's a forensic scientist, and she runs a major sleep laboratory and, a police department's DNA laboratory in Las Vegas. And I talked to her, and she told me about 1986 and the story. She would help me write the story as far as the technical aspects are concerned. I asked a lot of people for help. I created a little team of people. I had besides my writing coach, I had a retired police detective, a Biddeford police detective that I knew from my years in Biddeford, who worked with me on all the criminal aspects of the story. I had a psychiatrist that I worked with who helped me on the psychological aspects of the story. I had a forensic scientist who helped me, and forensic accountant who worked with me. Whenever I needed advice on subject matter that was in these stories, I was really concerned about authenticity. I really wanted these books to be as authentic as they possibly could. And if a reader doesn't sense that these are authentic, they're going to lose interest. And so I really went a tremendous amount of research and read extensively on all these different subjects, and sought help from experts that would help me. Lawyers, several lawyers helped me with all the legal aspects of the story. So I tried to make it as authentic as I could, and I think from what people have said,
What strikes me is I speak with you, I hear you, you're down to earth, very easygoing guy. How can you relate to the characters in your book who are anything but down to earth, easygoing people? How can you relate to that?
Well, there's one of the main characters in the story is a sleep scientist, and she appears in book one. She's a real hero. She fights the battle for all three novels, and she comes out on top. So I like that type of a character. I like a very strong woman to lead the story. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the ladies might not think that this is their kind of story, but there is a woman in that story who's very powerful and very heroic that I think they would enjoy reading about. I'm not sure what was the second half of that question.
Well, you answered the question. But we've talked about the subject matter of the books. We've talked about you. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the best way for people to contact, the best way for people to get their hands on the book.
Okay. Well, The Morpheus Conspiracy and the Surgeon's Curse is online, available on Amazon to purchase a copy of the book or download it on your Kindle. That's either one of those two options. Or you can order it right from my website, which I prefer because then I can send you a signed copy and write you a personal note. Go to my website, which is www.themorpheusseries.com. It's a mouthful. But if you look up my name, it'll take you to the Morpheus series on the internet. And you can go online on the internet and you can look at my webpage. It's got a lot about the stories, background on the stories, a little about me personally. It will link you to several newspaper articles that I've written. I enjoy writing letters to newspapers. I've had several published, one in the Boston Sunday Globe. So those articles are available on the website if you wanted to read them. That's a story I wrote about Cuba. And there's a story about Rwanda on the 20th anniversary of the genocide that was published in the Portland Press Herald. And there's a story about Richard Nixon's, the anniversary of Richard Nixon's inauguration in 1968. That was written in 1998, 2018, whatever it was. So there's a story about that and how I felt about that whole experience.
So for a person who was not a history major, you're writing about a lot of history.
Well, I've immersed myself in that period of time, the Vietnam War, and everything about it. The Ken Burns documentary that was on, last year, and it was tremendous. It was tremendous. What was really nice about it, I thought, was the fact that there were so many people that really don't know what happened during the Vietnam War. This generation wasn't alive. my kids didn't know anything about it, and this educated them. So my goal was to try to educate, hopefully get, just tell how terrible it was. This poor kid, a good kid, he had a future, he had a career, he had everything going for him, and he came home scarred and tormented, and unfortunately his life is ruined. That's a sad story, and that's what happened to these kids. I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal, but it just wasn't fair. It was just so unfair, but that's life. Not every life is fair. But what I would like to mention is that our feeling about all Vietnam vets, not all veterans, besides the Vietnam War. My father-in-law won a Silver Star in World War II. He was a medic. He was on the beaches during the invasion of France and was wounded and stayed and took care of people that were worse off than him and was a hero during World War II. We look at all veterans as heroes. And in our company, on Veterans Day, a year and a half ago, we erected what we call our Heroes Wall. And our company is located in the Biddeford Industrial Park. Anyone who goes through the Biddeford Industrial Park or knows about it can ride by. It's outside, it's all lit up. It's really nice. It's a real monument. And on that wall are plaques of names of all the veterans. The families have bought a plaque and decorated, put pictures of anything they want on that plaque. And those plaques, there are 700 plaques on the wall right now. Probably there's room for hundreds more on the other side. And it really touched a chord.
And I would say that wall speaks volumes about the quality of the character of VOLK packaging.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
and what VOLK packaging means to the Biddeford community at large. It's incredible.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. It was just wonderful, and it's people that come by all the time. We have designated parking spaces there for people to come, and they walk around the wall and they look at the tiles. And any veteran can have a tile. Active duty, not active duty, retired, whatever. Anyone who served in the military can have a plaque erected. And unfortunately, quite a few people are passed away. There are several World War I veterans that are on the wall. My father-in-law is on the wall. I'm a veteran, but I didn't put my plaque on the wall. But
if there's one thing that you have not covered yet, or if there's one thing that you have covered and you want to put additional emphasis to it, what might one of those things be?
Well, I experienced something that I thought was very, very powerful for me. I was on a plane ride. I'm not sure where or when it was exactly. I was on a plane ride, and the pilot got on the intercom to announce that there were returning soldiers from Afghanistan or Iraq on the plane coming home. I don't know how many there were, but there were a bunch. And the entire plane started to applaud. They just applauded these kids and to thank them. And that was wonderful. And they deserve every ounce of that respect and gratitude. But it just made me think about how poorly the Vietnam vets were treated and how polar opposite those two welcome homes were. It astounded me. And what's done is done. But hopefully we can educate and so people know what happened. Today, these Vietnam vets, I think they said there were 75,000 Vietnam vets that are homeless around the country. 75,000 homeless vets, Vietnam vets.
Don't get me going on that.
Okay, but there are quite a few of post-traumatic stress got the better of them. And
when I say don't get me going on that, I'm not saying that I differ with you on that. I very, very strongly agree with you, but I might lose my temper when I start thinking about it, because I think it's criminal.
You should. That's a very legitimate reaction to that. What's even worse is, unfortunately, my son is a physician in San Francisco, and he sees a lot of Vietnam vets, and San Francisco is a pretty gritty town, and he sees them coming in with drug and alcohol problems and broken marriages, and quite a few, more than it's just.
And we're running short on time, but I just want to make the comment that this push to give people who are crossing the border, give them the world, while we still have Vietnam vets and veterans of all wars struggling And it's inconceivable how a person in their right mind could even think of going down that road. But yet it seems to be, if there's a word endemic, it seems to be endemic in the world of politics these days. And it's sick. And it speaks very, very poorly of our society and very, very poorly about the future. Because our veterans will always have an impact on the future of this country. And if we maltreat the veterans of then and maltreat the veterans of today, this country is in sad, sad shape. And with that, Doug, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure having you.